Welcome to the Just Rocket Science show.
Thank you.
I'm your host, Akash Bhat, for today's episode.
Best part of what SpaceX has done, they have lowered the cost to launch. The cost to launch anything was hovering around $15,000 per kilogram. So SpaceX said, we need to cut that way down. They brought the cost of that down to $2,000 per kilogram, almost one order of magnitude, right? And now with Starship, they're targeting to get down to $200 per kilogram.
That is insane. Think about what that could do for the industry at large, but also smaller economies that perhaps don't have the budgets to invest in space programs.
That's the key thing. A successful SpaceX Starship enables people to take risk. We've shot 9 episodes of the Just Rocket Science show, and it's been a really fun journey. But for episode 10, we decided to flip the script. In this episode, my friend and the host of the Desi VC podcast, Akash Bhat, interviews me for my take on the current state of the space industry. Akash and I go way back, and we kick things off with some fun childhood memories. But then we dive into my love for space, my experience in the industry, and starting this show. We also talk about the hurdles of starting a space company while focusing on the financial, regulatory, and technical challenges. Akash is a former VC and the founder of Lean, a cybersecurity startup. So he brings in valuable insights and experience as we make connections between the industries of space hardware and software. In particular, we explore how funding works differently for space hardware, the unique risks hardware startups face, and why patient capital is essential for the space economy. So, if you're interested in learning more about the space economy from the perspective of your host, then this episode is for you. And thank you for being a part of my podcast journey so far. I'm excited to bring you a lot more episodes. Now, on to the show.
The warm-up I have for you guys. So you both have known each other for a very long time. You guys can take turns telling a funny story of when you guys hung out in your childhood. But not of each other. It doesn't have to be PC.
There's so many.
Yeah. Go for it, man. You first. If you already have one.
I have one, and it's pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, it's fine.
Do you remember 10th standard? Do you remember summer of 69?
Oh, wow. Oh, that was so rough. Go and tell the story, though. It's so rough.
So, probably not the best story to tell, but it's getting out there in the real world now. Yeah. This was 10th standard talent show competition. Yeah. Mr. Personality or whatever it was called.
It was called Mr. Personality, that's right.
And for some reason, the two of us decided that we should do it together as opposed to individually going up on stage. And all the way up until the final, everything was individual. And then we decided to collaborate and make it a... Yeah. You decided bring your guitar and...
It's a talent show,
guitar,
right?
And I thought I would sing. And nobody told us that we couldn't sing, and neither could we play the guitar really well. Maybe you do, but nobody told me I couldn't sing.
Play the guitar either. I still can't play the guitar.
And we go up on stage and we pick probably one of the hardest songs ever, which is Summer of 69 because...
By Bryan Adams.
By Bryan Adams.
Yep.
The pitch is so high.
Yep.
And we totally bomb on stage.
Yeah, we butchered the song. I butchered the guitar, and your vocals were, Indian Idol.
It was worse. I'm so glad we didn't have YouTube or camera phones back then, because I'm pretty sure that video would have haunted me for the rest of my life.
Hey,
that memory still haunts me.
Hey, it would have made you viral, and then you launched the podcast on that video platform. That would have been great.
I have no idea if I would have gotten into anything remotely close to audio after that, because it was a pretty scarring experience. Yeah. I don't think I went up on stage for about 6 months. The only thing that broke me after was a social science seminar, and I had to go up on stage and speak.
Yeah. This was an excellent trip down the nostalgia lane.
It was. Yeah. I'm so glad that, as I was talking to you before, you're perhaps the only one that has always shared what they wanted to do when we were young, and you're actually living that dream. I don't know many other people in school who said they wanted to do this and eventually go down the same route. So I'm so glad you are living that dream, and I'm super excited to be sitting here today and perhaps just talking to you a little bit more about that.
So welcome to the Just Rocket Science show, but are we switching roles?
There's something different about this show, isn't it, today?
Yeah.
We are doing something a little different. He is no longer going to be the host of this show. So I think we should just swap roles and see how this thing plays out. Well, welcome to the Just Rocket Science show.
Thank you.
I'm your host, Akash Bhat, for today's episode. And let me just ask you right out of the bat, how does it feel to be on the other side of the mic?
Surreal, because I've never really thought about what the guest position is. I mean, I try to understand how to go about approaching the guests with different questions, so I try to get the best out of them in the companies that they're building. But it's really cool to talk about my experience. And like I said, like 5 minutes ago, I've thought about space for pretty much as long as I can remember. And I've never stopped thinking about it. So this show seems like a natural extension to me.
And for the longest time, the only thing that I can associate you with is space. And we've been discussing about doing this for, I don't know, a few years now. And to see it culminate into this episode on your show is just surreal. So let's kick this the way that we wanted to when we initially had this conversation. What got you excited about space to begin with? Because this story goes at least 25 years back for you.
I mean, honestly, I just loved rockets and spacecraft and things that fly all the time. I think my earliest memories of being in love with space was like playing Microsoft Flight Simulator. I would spend literally hours and hours on a computer flying a plane from like Bangalore to London or whatever, in the original like sort of like real time mode, not even accelerating the time, and just being in love with like things that fly for some reason, something visceral about it that I can't seem to put into words. And then the practical aspect of getting into space was, okay, what can I have a career in? You can build the spacecraft, you can be an astronaut. And to me, building the spacecraft seemed very interesting. And I think there came a time in my college career where I was torn between airplanes and space. And this is where professors really have an impact on the things that you do. And I had a really great professor, Dr. Line, who brought out a lot of passion in space, and that's how I ended up picking a career in space. And I've built rockets and satellites and a lot of different things, and it's been really exciting.
That's fantastic to hear, but let's take you down memory lane again, because a lot of us, I did this, and I know a lot of my friends did this. Growing up, we say we want to be an astronaut, we want to be in space, we want to, work in this really exciting industry. But what does it really take for somebody who is as early in like early high school to start thinking about this to be a viable career? What did you do differently than just say me? I wanted to be an astronaut as well, but that idea or that dream never materialized in any way, shape, or form. So what things did you do differently to get more information about this industry that gave you more conviction that this could actually be a viable career option for you?
That's a good question. I think concrete steps towards materializing what I wanted to be a career in the aerospace field, and particularly in the space field, probably started to materialize around the time when we had our like board exams. Like, that's often framed as the most important career trajectory point in our life. We could argue that it is or isn't, I don't know. But I remember thinking about, and we had the benefit of the internet at the time. The internet was still pretty nascent in India,
right?
Where we were growing up. And while it was still nascent, we still had Google search engine. It was pretty good. And there you start exploring different ideas on the internet about how other people have found careers in the space industry. I remember looking up talks by people from NASA. SpaceX and all of the other big aerospace companies today weren't as much of a thing back then, of course, but NASA certainly was. They had landed rockets on the moon. I remember watching a lot of documentaries and movies about these people, and specifically when you see these people on TV, and then there's a title card that comes up on the left that says John Smith, engineer of structures or engineer of payload, et cetera, and then you start finding these terms, and then you start Googling these terms, and then that's when I found out, okay, this person had a career in engineering. They had a career in what's called aerospace engineering. Okay, so if I wanted to study aerospace engineering, where are the best universities that do that? And they were all in the United States at the time, and I go in and I find out about these courses and careers, and that's how I got to charting my career path in a practical sense.
That's very interesting because you don't often hear a lot of people doing this amount of research as early in their careers, especially during the time that we grow up. The traditional career path was go to engineering school, go to medical school, and
I
then
still
kind of figure it
followed
out.
the engineering career path, right? Like I still knew that the expectations were like, hey, do become an engineer or become a lawyer or a doctor. But the engineering part of it was very fascinating to me.
What was different when you moved to the US in terms of being exposed to the aerospace industry? Because you chose to come here because this is where all the innovation at that point of time was happening, or at least it seemed. We have evidence of that. What was different and what kind of made you, when you were here in university, fall in love with the aspect of space that you eventually ended up working in?
To be honest, at the university I went to, there was very little exposure to the companies, the aerospace companies that were dominant in the U.S. at the time. I went to a school in Tennessee, University of Tennessee, and at that time, big NASA centers that were dominant in the aerospace game would often frequent universities like Florida, um, in California, of course, where a lot of aerospace companies already exist. But I do remember that when I got into my third year of school, there was a lot of emphasis on building a design project, and there was an option to build an airplane centric project and an option to build a space centric project. I chose both because I loved both of them, so it meant spending more time in the spending more time after school doing homework. And I remember I talked to Professor One, who was like, I'm making an airplane landing wheel fairing. It's essentially a cover for the wheels of an airplane to reduce the amount of drag that the wheels create when they're in air, because they're fixed wheel airplanes, they don't retract. And they put these wheels, they put these welds over the wheels, and we test them in a wind tunnel. And that was like my first exposure to what would happen in an engineering company, where we would like have an assumption and go test it. My second professor gave me the task of writing a bunch of code to study how we would send a spacecraft from Earth orbit all the way to Pluto. And different ways of optimizing that trajectory gave me another window into understanding how the industry trades different aspects of different design decisions or mission architecture decisions that they need to make. So it was basically picking up a bunch of small projects that enabled me to understand what it was like to be a part of the workforce in the industry.
What fascinates me personally about just the space industry is how much it's evolved in the last 15 years. And coincidentally, you've been in that space for about 15 years now. No pun intended there. What have you noticed in terms of how much change has come about in the last 15 years versus, say, the 15 years before that, where you were perhaps being more of an outsider, trying to understand more about this industry through books and reading material on the internet, as opposed to somebody who's more of a practitioner at this point of time?
Yeah, you don't really cut your teeth until you're actually
In
the industry, in the industry and in it, right? The first time I remember just thinking of aerospace companies as giant corporations, 100,000 plus people that are employed across different parts of the country, and they're still there, they're still dominating the field. But for the first time, I remember, and maybe it was like 2011, 2013 is when I first heard about SpaceX, because a friend of mine in college went to an internship at SpaceX. And it was this up and coming company. Nobody had really heard about them. There's this guy with like $180 million. He puts 80 million to Tesla, 100 million towards SpaceX. And he's like, I want to make life multiplanetary. And I want to, actually, we should reuse these rockets because we're throwing away rockets and it's a waste of money and it's driving up the cost.
Wait a minute. Do we know this guy? Is this guy famous?
Yeah, he's very famous for a lot of reasons. And of course, we're talking about Elon Musk, who's really, his vision has definitely changed and impacted the industry a lot. Of course, like a lot of the credit also goes to the engineers and scientists at SpaceX. But I remember that was the first time I sort of heard about what the industry was doing, I heard about like, hey, there's a new change coming. I didn't really understand it because a lot of frankly, my version of what I saw in the space industry was that of like a big multinational corporation that's, you know, today we call that out as slow moving compared to like a SpaceX or a Blue Origin. And um, while that was the exposure to the industry at that time, it still didn't take away from from the fact that like there were a lot of other big companies and other big movers that NASA was still working with to keep the industry going.
The thing that is very interesting about what you mentioned there is one person, Elon Musk, has in some way democratized the access and also at the same time made it cool and more achievable than what previously was thought of is only achievable by governments or these larger corporations. Do you look back and say it was him that was a pivotal inclusion to this industry that kind of like changed the trajectory of where, space as we know it today is heading towards?
A lot of people did not take SpaceX seriously for a very, very long time.
Right.
A lot of people were against SpaceX or a new player coming into the market and sort of eating up the market share. It's only because of the fact that there was some financial runway and the timing was just about right where they made it successful. They demonstrated that a private company could take a rocket, they could build a rocket without significant involvement from the government, and then they could send it to space and they could demonstrate a satellite in orbit, which is one of the most difficult things to do from a both hardware and software and manufacturing challenge. So because that happened, I in my opinion is that the timing was just right and this industry took off, no pun intended.
That is so true. Timing is everything, not just in the space world, but also in any industry that you work in. In fact, a couple of days ago, I was having this conversation with a founder based in India who's running this company called Rebel Foods. And he's today trying to do something that my first startup was trying to do back in 2014. And we were just having this funny discussion of, I'm so glad that this is coming to life today, but also looking back and saying sometimes just being early to market is not going to be helpful because you need a lot of factors to help something come to life. You need investors to come into the picture and, provide you that capital. You need the right engineers, the right talent, the right know-how for you to attract. And that's only going to be possible if you actually have some capital in the bank, you're able to attract the talent. And more than anything else, you need regulatory frameworks to also somewhat favor you in terms of getting some big projects like this off the ground. And that's only happened in the last, 20 odd years. And typically you don't really necessarily allude to industries like this and say, oh, this can be privatized in a way that SpaceX has done and kind of inspired plenty other companies across the world, not just here in the US, to do so. And you had a guest previously who, is building a very exciting company based out of India in Pixel. So
talking about Awais Ahmed.
Yes.
And yeah, you're definitely right. He cites SpaceX as the number one inspiration, being so successful in the US and then using that as a framework to go to investors in India and saying, hey, we can do this.
Yeah.
And not just investors in India, investors all across the globe. And that's kind of sort of the best part of what SpaceX has done for the entire industry is from a technical standpoint, they have lowered the cost to launch. And I'll flash a graphic up here on the screen and I'll show you later. But the cost to launch anything was hovering around $15,000 per kilogram. That means if you want to launch 1 kilogram of a satellite, that's $15,000. So SpaceX said, we need to cut that way down. And they brought it down with the Falcon 9. They reused the Falcon 9. It comes and lands on a drone ship or back on land. It's a very cool view to see. And they brought the cost of that down to $2,000 per kilogram, almost one order of magnitude, right? And now with Starship, they're targeting to get that cost down because they're able to reuse the vehicle. they're targeting to get down to $200 per kilogram,
That is insane.
right? So
Just think about what that could do for the industry at large, but also smaller economies that perhaps don't have the budgets to invest in space programs.
yeah, I think that's the key thing, is that it enables people. A successful SpaceX Starship enables people to take risk. A lot of people cannot take risk with a new idea in space because to make sure it works, it's not deploying a code package. You got to put this thing in orbit and you got to make sure it works over and over again. And that's a very expensive thing to do. But if it's cheaper to launch and if you fail, who cares?
That is what I think the greatest companies in history have done. They have failed with large budgets. They have failed beautifully.
What's an example in a software world?
Think about it from an Apple point of view. Apple was one of the first large companies, or at least back then it was a startup, but then they launched what was the first personal computer. It was still expensive for the 1970s and 1980s, but think about what that has done to the industry since. You've really brought down what mostly was used in laboratories and for just, defense projects, or was used for surveillance and basically things that the government wanted to use computers for, and then bringing that to you and me. And it goes back to the power law, right? I mean, you have to, at the end of the day, bring this at scale to so many people and hope that one of them actually works out. So you've got to start investing in multiple projects like this and hope there's a breakout winner. And that breakout winner then enables you to then set the foundations, make mistakes, and make mistakes at large scales. Like this is what SpaceX is doing. SpaceX is, in my opinion, failing and succeeding, but has over the years failed wonderfully. And what I mean by that is, if you want to bring down the cost of 1 kg from 15,000 to 2,000 and then back to 200, you've got to be able to fail X number of times. You're not going to be able to bring that down with one experiment. You need to be conducting a few thousand experiments to figure out and be more efficient. And that can only be possible if you've got capital and you have, the engineers have that flexibility to say, hey, you know what? It's all right if this project fails, but we learn something from that failure and then take it forward to the next project and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit from personal experience. I didn't spend a lot of time at SpaceX. I did do an internship there when I was in grad school. I was working on rocket engines because I loved rocket engines. They throw fire out the back end. So I thought it was cool. That led me to an internship at SpaceX. And having that be the first internship that I've had, it's a drinking from a fire hose. They expect a lot of you. It's very demanding, but it's very unbureaucratic. You can do whatever you want in terms of getting the hardware out the door.
Right.
That is all they care about, is make sure you get this thing on the next rocket so we can test it quickly. We don't want to wait. We don't want to wait for this analysis thing to be perfect. We want this thing to be the best way to test this thing is to just put it right on the rocket. Let's fly it. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
As long as it doesn't affect the primary mission, that is the most important thing. As long as it doesn't affect that, that's fine. We'll accept the risk. And I think that mentality is seeping through some startups now. And I'm willing to bet those are the startups that will succeed.
That goes back to your question about what happens in the software world. YC and many other VCs actually have this as a manifesto. They say fail quickly. The reason they say fail quickly is because you have the flexibility of evolving way faster than the incumbents, the larger incumbents in the industry can. And no one's going to care if you actually fail when you're such a small startup. Because the amount of capital that somebody has put in is maybe $5 million, $10 million, $20 million, which in the large scale of things is still such a tiny, tiny corpus. Think about how much NASA invests or SpaceX is investing today into research. R&D budgets are so huge. Mm-hmm. So I was just reading about this blog post the other day. I forget who it was, Calvin something who wrote about this, and he was talking about the amount of budget that's allocated from the U.S. defense industry towards just R&D, and the costs are upwards of $180 billion. Now, that to me was staggering because that's a lot of money, that taxpayer money that's going into R&D. But where's that R&D actually coming out on the other side? If you go back to the 70s and 60s, the R&D budgets that the defense sector set aside were utilized for computing expenses. Those are the ones where you saw breakthrough coming out of supercomputers and supercomputers to personal computers and so on and so forth. The US defense actually was one of the early um, catalyst behind computers being, in our houses. If I can, trickle down so quickly and say they were the ones who actually made it happen, and they're also the ones who are putting a lot of research money into how can we get more. Let me rephrase that. They're putting more money not just into their own projects, but also money into how they can support early stage companies get this research out on behalf of the US defense in general, or the US government in general. How do you see that playing out? Do you really feel that we're heading towards a time where the government is more invested in the space industry than ever before? Because it's almost inevitable for that to be happening. You're not going to see just the government play a huge role in space or in defense or cybersecurity. You have to be very plugged in with the private markets for you to come out with a joint innovation program, as opposed to just saying we're going to be the flag bearers of innovation in this particular industry.
Yeah. Historically, how this is played out is that the government is a anchor customer for pretty much every space company.
Yeah.
Every space company will tell the government that they want to, and they are very interested in providing services to them, whether it be in the manufacturing space or whether it be building a satellite for them and offering it to operate for them, but under their requirements and under their specifications and sort of lease time. Cybersecurity, that's a big, and you're already in the cybersecurity space, right? So that's a very big aspect that the governments are interested in because of national security and national defense applications, where you don't want satellites who now have onboard computers to be hacked or to be compromised in any sort of way. So the government, I think, will continue to be an anchor customer, but where the government will move to, in my opinion, is that they will start to serve more of the regulatory function and unburdening companies to be able to execute their missions in space, as opposed to directing companies with critical build requirements. So historically, NASA and other big governments will drive the requirements. They'll say, here's a big requirements documentation. Your spacecraft has to meet all of these things. There are some programs that are public-private partnerships. There are some programs that are purely science mission-based, so they're called discovery class missions.
Mm-hmm.
But I start to see that as the amount of investment in the industry grows and as the number of companies come up and shape out, as the costs of launch drop down, the government will want to step back because it's a more efficient use of capital, in my opinion, to use the existing assets and existing capabilities and existing amount of innovation that's already happening within these companies, and say, like, I'm just going to buy that one off. It fits my bill. I'm going to fly my mission. Why don't you just, this is what we want to achieve. Can you achieve it? Maybe a few people will bid on it, and then they'll go achieve it on their own. We talked about a little bit about regulatory framework. I think that's like the most important one to address now. I mean, there are a lot of most important ones. Just talk to me on a different day. I'll tell you something else. But the regulatory framework is very interesting because since the cost of launch is dropping down and the access to space is improving, there are a lot of new companies with new different ideas that haven't really been thought of recently, that are popping out. But we have no regulatory framework. One such example is this new space company called Varda Space Industries. Their thesis was simple. We always send stuff to space, but when they're done with their useful life, we can't really have a good way to bring them back.
Right.
You either need a human to go sort of pick it up and pack it up and then put it in a heat safe box and bring it back, or you just burn it up in the atmosphere.
And both are expensive.
And both are very expensive and wasteful. So what they did was like, we'll be an Earth return company. So say you want to test something in space, and the first thing they made was a antiretroviral drug that was developed in space. And the reason you want to do that is that the microgravity helps align the crystals in a different way than it would in a gravity environment. So they want to serve as a player where they make stuff in space and they bring it back down. But they had some challenges with regulatory in terms of like getting the proper licensing to return something to Earth. You always need a license, in the US at least, to launch something to space. It has to be approved by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. So Varda had some challenges with figuring out how to work with the government to like get this package back to Earth safely, and that meets all of their requirements, that doesn't, impose strict legal requirements. But it took some time where the spacecraft was just orbiting in space. And, you could think, hey, what's the big deal? It's orbiting in space. It's not gonna spoil, right? For lack of a better word. But every spacecraft is designed for a certain amount of time, and in terms of its useful components that can enable its return. So maybe there were some life-limiting functions there that needed to expedite, and the mission could have sort of been compromised if they didn't execute on time. So I think addressing that is going to be a pretty big challenge, because government's always going to want to look out in the interest of the public, as they should, and companies going to want to make sure that they execute on their mission and prove to their investors that they have a product.
Yeah, I've got 2 follow-up questions for you, and let me start out with the FAA bit. You talked about how this company has to go through, let's call it somewhat a bureaucratic process to get a license to launch something into space. Can you share with your listeners what some of these processes look like?
I actually don't know from a specific standpoint, because I don't work in the launch industry, and I don't work on the regulatory side of things.
How easy is it?
It's time consuming. Often the process has to be started months in advance.
Yeah.
It usually involves, if you're launching something into space, assuming you're the satellite on board, right? Like if it's different for a rocket, it's different for a satellite, it's different for something coming back to Earth. But if you're a satellite on board, and you have like radio communications back to relay your telemetry, one of the requirements that has to be verified by the government is that, hey, I want to make sure you're not using any bands of frequencies that interfere with critical communications or communication spectrums that have already been assigned. So they have to sort of write up like, this is the bands we're using, here's the proof, and sort of like show them the proof that like, this is what your equipment will do. This is sort of the model and the make of the radio antennas that you're using. So it's detailing out these things and sort of like checking the boxes by an independent authority that hasn't really been automated yet. So I think there are a lot of people in the industry right now that understand the challenge there, and they're working to try to automate it where it can be as simple as like you upload something onto a computer and there's an automated review process that's a pretty quick turnaround time.
Yeah, there's a reason I asked that question, because one of the things that we've seen in the software industry or the other industries is that it's time to launch something. And I don't mean that just in the context. I think every word that we use here is probably going to be very, in some way related to a launch. But what I mean is, when you want to get something off the ground very quickly, you then want the regulatory industry around that to be very supportive and the bureaucracy to be as minimal as possible.
Right.
And we've seen that happen in other industries where if you want to launch, let's say, a program in cybersecurity, you want to perhaps launch like a startup. Like if it's very difficult for you to just go get a business license, if it's even difficult for you to incorporate a company, it's going to take you 6 to 9 months, then the number of people entering that industry are probably going to be fewer than you'd imagine, because there's friction. And I would assume that the space industry is already very complex. And for you to then make the regulatory industry not in favor of those who are, coming in and trying to like disrupt the space, it's going to be a challenge for you to keep building and coming out with new innovations. And that's the reason I asked, how easy is it for you to get these licenses? Because then you need the regulators to be very hand in hand with the people on ground, the investors, the founders, the government in some sense, to then make sure that these processes are streamlined as much as possible. And if you can bring that licensing process down, let's assume it's 6 months down to 3 months, and maybe perhaps 1 month, that is just going to revolutionize the industry at large.
Yeah, I agree. Again, it's a time when the industry itself is so nascent that regulators and government, they're trying to keep tabs, and they're trying to keep tabs on the new the new ideas of tech and new forms of technology that's coming. So a lot of the work that I'm trying to do on the podcast, for example, is sort of trying to bridge this awareness gap. There's an awareness gap where not everybody, the information isn't easily available as to what companies are trying to do in the space industry, whether it's trying to utilize economics in space, asteroid mining, last mile delivery, or what have you. All of these ideas that these companies can think of, they have to be broken down into a simpler format that is part of like a government form that you can fill in, you can populate. But these systems are not set up yet to be easily accepted and processed. And I think that's an area that is under serious discussion right now. There are a few startups that I can't think of their names, but there are a few startups that are actively trying to lobby Washington, D.C. to try to get them to change the process.
And the cost of going wrong here can be very expensive.
Yeah, it is, and I mean, often kills a company because it just took too long.
But even the other side, I mean, if you're the government and get the process wrong, let's say, for instance, you bring it down from 6 months to 3 months, and you've overlooked something that previously was really important, the cost of that for the government is huge.
Yeah. This is, I think, especially true in terms of the launch industry, because a rocket is a sort of this controlled explosion that's flying off the ground.
Yeah.
And aspects like public safety are always critical and have to be triple checked.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want to leave that to chance. So I understand that part of me understands the sentiment behind it, but maybe the entrepreneur in me is like, let's go, let's do this.
Let's go there. Let's get there as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you touched upon, about 15 minutes ago, was how important capital is to getting these companies off the ground and getting the R&D budgets going and getting these projects into space and back and so on and so forth. This is perhaps a question that most companies are thinking about in the long term. And most VCs kind of get this wrong as well. A lot of them, and I've heard and spoken to plenty of them, they feel that the biggest buyer or an exit path for most of these companies is either a buyout by the government or by one of the large 5 defense contractors or one of the existing players. But that story has a long way to go. Where do you think the space industry, or where do you feel the money can be made in the space industry, especially if you're a founder building a company today?
Yeah, from the founders I've talked to, Ian Cinnamon comes to mind. He's on episode 5. He's the CEO of this company called Apex Space. They are commoditizing satellites. Just a little background here that I'll share about his company is that satellites are usually built to a specification. A customer will provide like a detailed specification and list of requirements, and they're custom built. So sort of like a McLaren or a Ferrari, right? But Ian wants to build, a Ford Model T or like a mass-produced vehicle, a Toyota Corolla, and just make sure he's building a lot of them so people can go in and pick off the line. And his advice comes to mind because building a real business in space is a huge challenge today. There's a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm with SpaceX bringing the launch prices down. So VCs are sort of looking to see like, hey, where can we put money towards and where can we sort of make the most of our returns? But the one challenge that I foresee with a lot of VCs that are used to investing in the valley, but want to invest, say, in the space industry, any of the big VC firms that you can think of, is they understanding what the timeline to a return is very different from what a software industry is. And we'll go back to that the example of like just pushing git commit on something and then fixing the bug almost immediately. We can't really do that in the space industry, right? So it's going to take like a typical satellite build process about 4 or 5 years. And I think with these commoditization of these new space companies and what they're doing, I think they can bring it down to 1 or 2 years. So I think the Apex has actually a record of building a satellite bus from zero on paper to in orbit by 1 year. So that's sort of the accelerated timeline. I'd say 2 years is typical. But you'd want investors to stay on. If I were to, take the 2-year timeline and 3x that or like 4x that, that's, 6 to 8 years. Where they would probably make a decent amount of return back if the idea of commoditizing satellite buses materializes, and I think it will. So investor patience has to be much. Investors have to be much more patient than they are in the software world. So again, bridging the awareness gap is so important. It's what I'm trying to do. It's a lot of what other great media outlets in the space industry like Payload Space is trying to do, is try to bridge the awareness gap.
And I can talk to you a little bit about what investors get wrong from that perspective as well. When we were looking at it at my previous fund, we didn't really have any competence to be investing in space. And a fund like ours should not be the one that says, oh, we're going to invest X amount of dollars towards space. Unless your thesis is, I'm going to throw a bunch of darts at the board and hope one sticks. If that's your approach, it's a spray and pray approach, great, go ahead and do that. But for you to invest, as you mentioned, you need to have skin in the game. It is a long-term game that you're playing with space or any deep tech. It could be pharma, it could be research. All of these sectors don't give you a typical 6 to 7 year exit. They're perhaps longer than that, sometimes 15 years, sometimes 20 years. Do you have that much patience to go through with the process, and also capital to keep investing and have your pro rata in each one of those rounds? Because that's one of the things that investors don't really think about it when they're investing in those companies and spaces. Let's say you're a very early young $10 million fund and you raise your next fund, which is $25 million, and you're putting 100K, 200K into these companies, or 250K, 500K into these companies. Let's say you run, it's so little. One, it barely moves the needle.
Yeah.
But sure, for an early stage founder, let's say you're building out of India, you're building out of emerging markets, $500,000 is maybe 1/4 or 1/10 of what they might be completely raising. So it still makes up for that initial bit of capital that goes towards acquiring talent and building the V1 version of whatever they want to, get into the market out there. But let's say the fund itself isn't alive 10 years down the road. You can't really write that as part of your thesis from an investment point of view, saying this is a space that we're going to continue doubling down on when the rest of your fund is not performing well at all. Now, if space investments turn out to be 10% of your portfolio, but the 90% of your portfolio is unfortunately terrible, and your fund is not going to exist, you cannot put that into a thesis and say, this is where we'll continue to build and expect returns here. Because if your fund's not alive, forget about the investments, you don't have capital to double down on. And with each round of capital raised, your existing equity gets diluted further. And by the time let's say the company goes public, it's almost a few percentage points. I don't know if it's meaningful at that point of time. And even if your fund's around, which is why I think you need the big guys to be supporting plenty of these companies that break out. You need your Sequoias and your Andreessens, and you need I probably don't know who the active investors in space purely from a VC angle, but you do need the big guys to be coming in and investing, but you also need traditional funds who are purely looking into everything that's deep tech, who are looking and have patient capital involved, where you have government money, where you have wealth funds coming in, you have all these endowment funds and pension funds that are putting in capital because they're not looking to exit in 10 years. They're probably looking to exit in 15, 20, 30 years. Those are the kind of investors that you want backing, and they need to understand that this is not a short-term project.
Yeah, I draw the analogy of the evolution of the World Wide Web, and I say that because all of these traditional funds are skeptical about going into the space business.
Yeah.
Just purely from the standpoint that it's like visibly high risk. You could argue that the software world, at least from my perspective, is not visibly high risk.
Yeah.
I don't understand necessarily or have visibility into how codes break, and I'm like not looking into that day to day. But I can see a SpaceX rocket explode in a big, gigantic explosion, and that is scary. It's cool if you're like a observer and you see this dramatic fire show, but it's very scary if you're putting a lot of money into it, especially a pension fund where people's lives might be, but Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz A16Z,
Yep.
right? They're more so in the space game now. I've seen them as is Lux Capital, Space Capital, and I think again it goes back to how do I, as somebody who tries to communicate about this industry, and how do you, who's an intellectual, can understand this industry and make important decisions about risk towards funding a lot of these companies. And I think placing bets on them is a very important thing. And that goes back to the analogy of the World Wide Web, where like it was very expensive to have anything on the internet, a couple of decades ago. An Airbnb or an Uber wasn't really possible. There was no iPhone.
Right.
So all of this infrastructure was built by the heavy lifters, the Apple and the Google of the days. And they built all of this infrastructure for you to be able to go in and use AWS or like use all of these other services that are out there that are cheaper, that scale. And I think that's what we're trying to do in the space industry. SpaceX is trying to do that. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, is trying to do that. And NASA is trying to serve as an anchor customer to support a lot of these big and small companies.
Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about is even for these smaller investors, if they're coming in, putting these 200, 500K, $1 million checks, sure, they can exit with secondaries in the next rounds or so. But that doesn't then fundamentally build a thesis internally saying this is where we're going to be spending the next 10 years, because you need to be investing in that practice for the long term as well.
Can you define secondaries for me?
Yes. So,
and for my audience.
Of course. So let's say you invest 250K in a pre-seed round, and the next round the company and you put in 250K as an investor in a $1 million round. And the next time that company goes and raises a seed round of capital, they're perhaps raising $4 million. And you're now coming in and putting in $500,000 check, or you're exercising a pro rata, which is basically the same amount of, if you want to hang on to the same amount of percentage points, you need to be putting in X amount of dollars to retain that ownership. That is basically your pro rata. Now, let's say at Series A, you're raising...
Otherwise, your ownership dilutes.
Your ownership dilutes,
okay,
yes.
Got it.
Because you're not putting in the capital. And whatever your percentage points, that goes down. Now, let's say you're raising a Series A at a bigger valuation. You're now raising, let's say, a $10 million round. At that point, you as an investor could decide whether if I want to hang on to my ownership points, I need to be putting in X amount of dollars. But if I don't have that amount of capital left in my bank, then I can just sell my stake to a new investor that's coming into the round.
Okay, that's an internal trade.
It's almost like an internal trade.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So there's always that option for a VC to like say, hey, I'm going to just play the 3-4-year-old game. I'm going to get this company to a point where I think Series A, Series B investors get very interested, and hopefully that pays out. And if that's your strategy, great, get involved in the space industry. But I don't think that really moves the needle too much for the fund itself, because your secondary is not going to be a huge secondary round unless it's not like the software industry where you go from 0 users to 100 million users in like 3 years, and you're like, wow, this is fantastic growth. You're seeing revenue multiples, go up exponentially, and you're beating market comparables. And now you can be like, fantastic, I'm going to exit and then, show that fund economics playing out. Space is not that way. You're not going to go from 0 to 100. You're not going to launch anything perhaps in the first 2 to 3 years of just being around. Get to a revenue milestone.
Yeah, see, look at all of the launch companies that have come out since SpaceX, and it's very hard to launch something to space. So yeah, going from say even 0 to 1,000 users or people who want to launch on your rocket is very hard.
Yeah, it's where I feel investors perhaps need to understand the industry slightly better, which is what is happening in the last 10 years or so. You're seeing a lot of these niche funds come out and say, we'll dedicate 10% of our capital, 20% with the subsequent, and so on and so forth. And getting somebody who has domain knowledge and expertise. You cannot be a generalist investor, somebody who invests in every sector and then say, I'm also going to invest in space, because you need to understand the industry deeply. You need to understand the problems they face, the landscape a little better for you to even say, I'm going to put some money into this. You cannot go and look at a YC and say, great, there are 4 companies coming out of here. I'm going to give you $500,000. Because that then cannot trickle down to your fund's thesis. Yeah. You can do it. We've seen a lot of companies do it. We've done that in the past. But I don't think that is what's going to move the needle for the smaller funds. The bigger funds get it. They have a dedicated person. They have a team that's engineers, people who've been there, researchers, people who built companies, sold companies. These are the ones who are coming back and reinvesting back into the fresh crop of entrepreneurs that are coming in. Having said all of this, I was teeing you up for the next question. How do you think people can build companies in space, especially today, with very minimal capital, as opposed to going out and raising a large round to get the MVP out of the box?
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference that's evident there is you can actually build a decent MVP in the software world without having to raise any money at all.
Yeah.
You need a laptop and an internet connection, and that's fairly affordable for most people. In case of the space industry, depending on what you're building, it is at least a couple $1 million to get like a decent working product off the ground. So you need, at the start of it, you need an angel. You need angel investors to come in and say like, here's a couple $1 million. We believe in you. I mean, this like the story of Relativity Space comes to mind. Relativity Space started off by a couple of former classmates of mine at USC, Jordan Noon and Tim Ellis. They were both engineers at SpaceX and Blue Origin. And they had this idea that they want to build a 3D printed rocket. 3D printing can save a lot of material time and material costs by not having to outsource a lot of your products, a lot of your manufacturing to other shops. So you can sort of develop this large mega scale 3D printer to sort of print different sections of the rocket, whether it's small like the engines or like extremely large. And I remember this. They needed a working product. In their case, it was not a rocket; it was a 3D printer, and they had to pull together some amount of capital. And the way they did it was so interesting because they started cold emailing Mark Cuban, but trying to guess his email address. So Mark.Cuban, M Cuban, whatever combination permutation you can think of, Mark Cuban, and they were able to find it. And they asked for, I think, $100,000, and they ended up getting $500,000 from Mark Cuban and a few other bite-sized investments from other people, and they were able to build this 3D printer. Now, Relativity is about a $2 to $3 billion valued company in the market. They're yet to launch their first vehicle, but they've launched their first test vehicle. And they're about to launch their second vehicle to space with paying customers.
Bringing the question back to what you talked about with Mark Cuban, why are people like Cuban getting really excited about the space industry? You're not just seeing traditional people from the space going out and building in space. You're seeing a lot more of these internet entrepreneurs getting really attracted by the space industry. I'll leave out Elon and Jeff because I think they're the most common examples that come to mind. But when you take a look at all the angels that some of these people have, it's beyond just these two. You're traditionally seeing a lot more internet entrepreneurs getting into the space industry. Is it just pure capital that's exciting them? Or is it really being part of this larger story of the next 50 years? we all in our lifetime, in some way, shape, or form, are going to see the first man or woman make it to another planet. Is that the excitement?
Yeah, there's multiple layers to that question, in my opinion. When you talk about internet entrepreneurs, I think of even one more that came out recently, and I say this because this is topical. Baiju Bhatt, who is the co-founder of Robinhood, now has a space company. It's called
Interesting.
Ather Flux, and his plan is to beam solar energy down from space, up from space down to Earth using laser links, and I talk about that example because it does seem like every internet entrepreneur, outside from the first two, Elon and Jeff, want to get into the space game. And I think space is this. It's this sort of fascination. It's space has always been fascinating to a lot of people, right? We've had TVs and movies and TV shows all about space, Star Wars, Star Trek. It was a fascination in the 60s and 70s ever since we started going to space, whether it was the Cold War between the US and Russia, and then onto the 90s where we had the space shuttle. It's always drawn this element of awe and inspiration. And that's certainly one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that they already have capital to begin with because they've had successful exits with the internet business. And like I mentioned on the previous question, you really need a lot of capital initially to start and prove your product, or you at least need angel investors who believe in you to fund your first MVP. But I think it's exactly why they want to get into it now, because there's this inspiration. It's like such a huge challenge to, whether it's to land a person on Mars or mine an asteroid, which is another company. There's a company called Astroforge that's mining asteroids. SpaceX, of course, has been very vocal about wanting to go to Mars. So I think there's an awe-inspiring challenge that people can go do it. Also, there is a huge return on investment potentially with certain ventures like asteroid mining. Asteroid mining, the example is that there are certain asteroids that are metallic, that have large reserves of rare earth elements that, for example, like platinum, which is hard to find on Earth and very expensive. But if you could go mine this asteroid and bring large amounts of platinum back to Earth and you can refine it, then you change the economics of platinum production, and you potentially make a lot of money. Orbital debris cleanup, space data. There's a lot of data in the space industry that people want to process. So there's a lot of different opportunities, and I think people are taking bets.
Well, speaking of opportunities, let's put you on the spot. Let's say some investor today was supposed to hear this episode and walk up to you and give you, let's say, $5 million.
Okay.
What are you going to start?
$5 million. I will not start a satellite or a launch company because that is not enough money.
That's just the first check. It's just there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just say that's an initial investment to prove. In my opinion, there needs to be more companies that are working on orbital traffic management. There are a few companies out there, Slingshot, Aerospace, and Leo Labs, that are working on space traffic management. As the number of launches increase, like SpaceX has already launched 100 satellites this year, which is an amazing achievement. We're not even through the end of the year. So the amount of crowding up in space is going to get more significant. Now, let's keep in mind that space is still big. There's a lot of space around everything. But managing this traffic, that's going to be a huge effort in not just tracking different assets and different satellites in orbit, but also at the same time, it's going to be a lot of international coordination. So there's going to be, that is what I would use. That is how I would allocate my 5 million as the most efficient use of capital towards something that is a meaningful business that would hopefully provide some return on investment.
So it's more to do with managing how people are getting their stuff into space, and then having I wouldn't say regulatory framework around it, but at least having a structure around how then to police some of the launches, some of the work that's being done in a in a space that probably has no supervision.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say police. It's just awareness. I would like to know if there's another satellite coming in my orbit in the next 300 days, so I can sort of take avoidance maneuvers early. Um, and I would like to know if I would launch something else, where is the best place to launch, so I'm not constantly changing my orbit to avoid other people. It's traffic management.
Why can't another startup who's already in space do that for themselves by just building this as a module, as one aspect of what that company does?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's sort of like MCAS, if you've heard of MCAS, which is
Yeah.
a maneuvering characteristics augmentation system on an airplane, which sort of tells the pilot in situ. I don't know if that exists or not yet, but that would be a great one to approach it with.
Interesting. The reason I asked you that question is because I wanted to understand where the opportunities today in space exist. From the time that 4 years ago, when I was first developing this thesis internally, the only things that we looked into was just space cleanup, and that was like a very niche space within the industry to be even delving deeper into. And today, you're just in this last 50 minutes or so, we've talked about at least 12 different sectors within the space industry where companies are being built. And if you were to put your money, let's flip that question a little bit. Somebody's giving you money, now you're putting your money on something. Where do you think the next big opportunity in space lies? And what are the blind spots against that you foresee not giving you an investment on that investment?
Yeah, I think I would split my money in two different ways from the people that I've had the pleasure to, the people I've had on the show that I've learned from. I would put my money in two different ways. Um, I think one aspect of it is I'm going to leave out intentionally the orbital debris question because I already answered that. But we know that the cost of launching satellites into space has gone down significantly, but the cost of building a satellite hasn't actually gone down significantly.
Right.
That's still a pretty major pain point for like the next tier customer. If you think of tier 0 as the launcher, like a SpaceX or a Blue Origin, and tier 1 as the customer who launches their payload on their satellite, still tier 2 is like somebody who's buying the satellite. It's still a very expensive process. So I would definitely put my money on commoditization of satellites. We need we need the satellites to be commoditized. The other aspect that I would put my money on is the last mile delivery for space, which I mentioned a little while ago. So
Yeah.
the example of last mile delivery is we have Amazon or any of the big e-commerce platforms that contract with like a UPS, which provides that last mile delivery from within the neighborhoods. There is a similar service called Impulse Space. It was started by SpaceX's former vice president of propulsion, brilliant guy, Tom Mueller, and he has this idea to become essentially a service where SpaceX can now just go drop off a bunch of satellites into a low Earth orbit where the booster can go back and land on land and be serviced and do all the things it does. Then Impulse with their spacecraft will come grab the satellite and go deliver it to you in the orbit that you want. So it's taking you to the final orbit. Why can't the satellites themselves do it? They can. They certainly can do it themselves, but it's propulsion. They have to expend
money.
energy.
Yeah.
Therefore, more money and more time.
Yeah.
So that's a very exciting company. I think I will also have to say a third company that I'm a little biased towards is Luke Fisher and Skyfi. They are building a satellite imagery analytics platform, which is trying to make obtaining satellite imagery as easy as obtaining an Uber on your phone. And
that's pretty cool.
And that's a really cool one because the story behind Luke, I just want to share this with you, is like it was very hard to get satellite imagery on that. You have to try to strike these deals for large amount of images. I'm like, no, I just want that one image because I want to see how much oil is in this tanker so I can place the appropriate bet. So I can just take an image of the tanker with a satellite, right? And so it was very complicated. So he went in and he started where Sky-Fi will work with different data providers of satellite imagery, and it's on their platform. You can download the Sky-Fi app right now, and you can download an image for a price.
That is pretty cool.
And that's awesome. That's a great bet to place.
And that's a consumer product.
That is a consumer product, yeah. It's also a government product.
It's also yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
But consumers, yeah, you and I can just open an account today, and they have a vast repository of free images. So you can also get free images.
That is really nice. And I'm sure that's a great tool to have even for storytelling.
Yeah.
Especially for your podcast to begin with, but also in general for you to educate the larger audience who's interested in this industry. This could be students, this could be people within, people, VCs who don't really understand the space as such. You could have somebody just come in, use some of these images, quite similar to what Shutterstock you previously used to do, which is stock images for any other space.
Yeah, exactly. And being on the open data market, it's a very easy thing to do.
That's amazing. One of the things that you do on the show is, you ask your guests about contrarian opinions. Do you hold any yourself?
About the space industry?
Of course.
I do hold a lot of contrarian opinions about the space industry. And I think my number one bet about the space industry is that I call it the out-of-the-box ideas of the space industry are the ones that, in my opinion, are going to make it make the industry very economically successful. So what do I mean by that? Now, there are a lot of companies, and I'm not knocking on any of the companies, but there are a lot of companies that are taking safer bets, let's say, within or like working on improving something by 10% or 20% of something that a big prime or one of the big companies is already doing. And that's great. That's very important for the industry. But there are other companies that I'm really excited about that are, in my opinion, going to move the needle. That's my contrarian bet, like an Impulse Space with the last mile delivery, Astroforge with satellite mining, Ather Flux by Jubat's company, which is going to beam solar energy down to Earth. There's Lumen Orbit, which is also a Y Combinator company that is trying to store data centers in space, just because it's cold up in space. So let's just move all the data centers up to space. So I think my contrarian bet is that the bets that these companies are placing is the one that's going to turn out to be very lucrative for the industry. And by lucrative, I mean that Morgan Stanley currently estimates that the space industry as a whole, all of it, satellites, rockets, data services, everything in between, is about $400 billion today. They expect that to grow to 1 to 2 trillion in the year 2040. So about 16 years from now. And I'm willing to bet that these are the companies that are going to take up large chunks of that market share in 2040. I think it's going to be more than 2 trillion, especially with Starship coming online so soon.
So it's safe to say that we're just getting started.
We are just getting started. And again, I'll go back to my World Wide Web analogy. It's going to be easier to build in space. And it's going to be easier to fail fast in space.
Yeah.
And it's going to be easier to just move on and build a successful company.
I love that. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. And I've learned so much just sitting across and hear you talk passionately about the space industry. And you've given me at least a few data points to go back and do a little bit more research into. And, you and I keep going back and forth and you share some articles with me from time to time. But I think my interest is piqued after having this discussion with you. So I thank you for sharing all of these insights with not just me, but your audience as well. But I'm walking away 10% more smarter, just wanting to learn more about this industry. So thank you so much for that.